The story begins not with a scream in the night or a frantic search party combing the woods, but with a short, almost dismissive article in a local paper. In the winter of 1912, the Springfield Republican printed a small notice buried among weather reports and shipping news. Just 3 paragraphs long, it spoke of a domestic disturbance in Taney County, Missouri, where a woman named Eliza Whitlock had apparently left her home after a quarrel with her husband. The husband, Thomas, told officials she had gone of her own accord. The sheriff found no cause for alarm, and so, officially, the matter ended there. But the silence of that brief report was deafening. It gave no hint of the storm it foreshadowed, no suggestion that beneath those few words lay one of the most unsettling mysteries in the Ozark Mountains. To the reader in 1912, it was just another footnote in the hardships of rural life. To us, more than a century later, it is the first thread of a story that would unravel into suspicion, dread, and ultimately, horror. The Missouri Ozarks were an unforgiving landscape at the time. This was not the pastoral postcard of rolling hills and cheerful streams that tourists imagine today. In 1912, the Ozarks were raw, rocky, and isolating. Homesteads often sat miles apart, hidden behind steep limestone bluffs and dense forests of oak and pine. In winter, heavy snow sealed families into their hollows for weeks at a time. The nearest neighbor might be less than a mile away as the crow flies, but in practice, he might as well have been on the other side of the world. It was in this harsh, secluded environment that Thomas and Eliza Whitlock built their life. Their property, 40 acres of rocky hillside, lay outside the small settlement of Walnut Shade, 15 miles south of the county seat at Forsyth. On those acres stood a 2-story timber-framed house, a small barn, and several outbuildings. County records tell us that Thomas, once a department store clerk in Springfield, had purchased the land in 1908. The records describe him as of quiet disposition and particular habits, words that seem mundane but, in hindsight, cast a shadow. Eliza, born Eliza Crawford, had once been a schoolteacher in Christian County. She was known for her intelligence and gentle manner. In 1905, she married Thomas, and by 1912 they had 2 children, Edward, 6, and Mary, 4. The Whitlocks were not social people. Neighbors later remembered that Thomas occasionally rode into town for supplies, but Eliza was rarely seen beyond the edges of their property. Their privacy, in a place where privacy was the rule, seemed unremarkable at first. But isolation in the Ozarks had a double edge. For some, it meant freedom, the chance to escape debts, old feuds, or the weight of society's expectations. For others, it became a prison, a silence too deep to bear. Families could vanish into those valleys, unnoticed, unmissed. The mountains swallowed both secrets and people. Joseph Miller, who lived to the east, would later recall that the Whitlocks kept to themselves but seemed content enough. In a 1952 interview, Miller remembered Thomas as stiff and watchful, a man who guarded his land boundaries with unusual precision. Eliza was more reserved still, speaking little, her children clinging to her skirts. To Miller, they were just another family in a region where solitude was a way of life. But in late 1911, things began to change. That autumn, Thomas started making odd improvements to the homestead. He reinforced the doors of the house with new locks. Behind the house, he dug a new root cellar, deeper, wider, and more carefully constructed than most neighbors considered necessary. When asked, he explained it was for storing produce against the hard winter ahead. But the shape of the excavation struck Miller as peculiar, more like a trench than a cellar. In November, the last outsider would see Eliza alive. Harriet Bowman, a midwife from Walnut Shade, was summoned to the house after receiving word that Eliza was unwell. Bowman later testified that she found Eliza pale, distant, and nervously glancing at her husband. The house itself was strangely cold, despite a fire burning in the hearth. Thomas stood in the room throughout, answering most of the midwife's questions himself. When Bowman suggested Eliza visit a doctor in Forsyth, Thomas dismissed the idea. "We cannot afford such expense. Rest will bring her strength back." Bowman left uneasy, her instincts telling her something was wrong. Meanwhile, county bank ledgers revealed Thomas was draining their modest savings, nearly half gone between September and December of that year. He told the bank manager the money went toward home improvements and winter preparations. The explanation was plausible enough, yet the scale of his withdrawals raised eyebrows. For a man of quiet means, Thomas seemed to be spending far beyond necessity. Then came the winter of 1911-1912, one of the harshest in memory. Temperatures plunged below zero, snow piled thick, and families across Taney County were sealed into their homes by ice and drifts. For weeks at a time, no one came or went. In such silence, anything could happen. It was in this cocoon of snow and solitude that Eliza Whitlock vanished. The precise date was never fixed, sometime between late February and early March. One day she was simply gone, and the hills closed in around the secret. When Thomas finally mentioned her absence to Joseph Miller weeks later, he did so in a flat tone. "The missus has gone away," he said, and offered nothing more. In a place where neighbors respected silence, Miller did not press. And so, Eliza became a ghost in her own time, disappeared, unnamed, and officially forgotten. The paper recorded her as a wife who chose to leave. The sheriff, seeing no evidence of crime, closed his book. The world moved on, but the land did not forget. Beneath the frozen ground, beneath the reinforced locks and the cellar newly dug, something waited. The silence that had protected the Whitlocks' privacy now protected a deeper horror. The article in the Springfield Republican was not the end of a story, it was the prologue. What happened to Eliza Whitlock would remain hidden for decades. Yet in every whisper of wind through the pines, in every hollow where sound carried strangely through the night, her absence was felt. A valley can keep a secret for a long time, but not forever. To understand the disappearance of Eliza Whitlock, one must first step inside the rhythms of her family's life, quiet, rigid, and steadily tightening like a snare. Thomas and Eliza had not always been shadows in the Ozarks. When Thomas worked as a clerk in Springfield, he was regarded as a man of routine, a figure who kept accounts in neat columns and left little impression beyond his punctuality. Eliza, in contrast, had once stood in the front of classrooms in Christian County, teaching children letters and sums with a steady hand. They married in 1905, and at first theirs seemed a hopeful match. A dependable clerk and an educated young woman, building something new in the Missouri hills. But when they moved to Taney County in 1908, a transformation began. Their timber-framed home on 40 rocky acres became less a dwelling and more a fortress. At first, their retreat into privacy seemed ordinary. Many families in the Ozarks preferred isolation. Yet over time, their solitude grew absolute. Neighbors remembered that Thomas still made the occasional trip into town, but Eliza all but disappeared from public view. Some said that after her first year on the land, she was never again seen beyond the boundary of their homestead. That kind of silence breeds speculation. The Ozarks, after all, were a place where men with debts or feuds often sought to vanish. The land provided cover for both those running from others and those running from themselves. By the fall of 1911, Thomas's behavior had shifted in ways that disturbed even his taciturn neighbors. He began making curious improvements to the property. Most notably, he dug a new root cellar behind the house, cutting into the stony earth with grim determination. Joseph Miller, whose land lay to the east, later recalled the structure as unusually deep, with its outline shaped more like a trench than a larder. At the same time, Thomas reinforced the doors of his home with extra locks, an odd precaution in a valley where strangers were scarce and theft nearly unheard of. Inside the home, unease grew. The last confirmed sighting of Eliza came in November 1911, when midwife Harriet Bowman visited after receiving word that Eliza was unwell. Bowman's testimony decades later paints a haunting portrait, a woman pale, nervous, and guarded in her own house. Despite a fire glowing in the hearth, the air inside was chill, and Eliza scarcely spoke without her husband's gaze on her. Bowman noticed Thomas answering many questions on his wife's behalf, as though her voice had been commandeered. When Bowman suggested Eliza consult a doctor in Forsyth, Thomas's reply was curt and final: "We cannot afford such expense. Rest will bring her strength back." That same autumn, Thomas began draining the family's savings. County bank ledgers show a steady stream of withdrawals from their modest account, nearly half their funds gone by December 1911. When the bank manager, Harold Winters, asked about the sudden expenditures, Thomas explained they were for winter preparations. Such spending was not unheard of. But for a man of Thomas's means, the sums seemed excessive. Winters remembered the conversation years later, troubled by how easily he had dismissed his unease. The winter of 1911-1912 descended with a vengeance. The Springfield Weather Bureau recorded temperatures plunging to near zero. Snow fell heavy and lingered until mid-March, sealing homesteads in icy isolation. Roads became impassable, mail delivery erratic, and for weeks entire valleys lay cut off from the outside world. Families lit lamps, rationed supplies, and endured the howling winds. It was during that deep freeze that the Whitlock household seemed to grow stranger still. Neighbors noted a kind of silence around the property, a stillness even more profound than the snowbound woods themselves. Smoke rose thinly from the chimney, but no one came or went. Within those locked doors and cold rooms, something was shifting, tightening. The last clear impression of Eliza is the image Bowman gave us, pale, distant, and watched. But from scattered details, we know the tension in that home was rising. The cellar being dug at odd hours, the money vanishing from the bank, the locks multiplying on the doors, and a man whose quiet habits were transforming into something more obsessive. The Ozarks had always been a place where houses stood alone in the woods, their secrets sealed inside. But the Whitlock house was different. It was not just isolated, it was fortified, a place that seemed to be locking itself against the outside world, and perhaps against the woman within it. When the thaw came and the snow began to melt, Eliza was no longer seen. The silence of the hills had swallowed her. The first whispers of Eliza's absence came not from an official report, but from the lips of her husband himself. In late March 1912, weeks after the heaviest snows had begun to thaw, Joseph Miller encountered Thomas Whitlock on the road to Forsyth. Miller later remembered the moment clearly. Thomas stood stiff in his wagon, his voice flat, his eyes fixed elsewhere. "The missus has gone away," he said, offering no explanation. Miller, steeped in the culture of Ozark privacy, did not press for details. In these hills, questions were weapons best left sheathed. But Eliza had family outside of Taney County. Her sister, Catherine Crawford of Springfield, had not heard from her since the autumn. At first, Catherine thought the winter storms had delayed letters, but as spring approached with no word, her worry deepened. She wrote to the postmaster at Walnut Shade, who returned a troubling reply. Locals believed Eliza had left her husband and children. Refusing to accept such a claim, Catherine packed her belongings and rode south, determined to confront the truth in person. Her arrival forced the hand of the local authorities. Catherine's insistence that her sister would never abandon her children moved Sheriff James Harmon to investigate. On the 18th of April 1912, Harmon rode out to the Whitlock property. His official report describes a homestead in tidy order, Thomas present, both children fed and clothed, the house undisturbed. When questioned, Thomas explained that Eliza had grown dissatisfied with their isolated life. She had taken some personal effects and left, perhaps for Springfield, though he could not say. Harmon inspected drawers and trunks, noting that certain clothing items were indeed missing. On paper, the evidence matched Thomas's words. The report concluded simply, there was no sign of foul play, and as an adult, Eliza had the right to leave her family if she so chose. Catherine, though unconvinced, had little power to argue. In the eyes of the law, the matter was closed. But Harmon's private notebook, discovered years later after his death, told another story. There he confessed to unease, writing that Whitlock was too composed for a man recently abandoned. He noted how the children stared at their father's face before answering the sheriff's gentle questions, as if gauging his approval before speaking. Edward, the 6-year-old, had begun to mention his mother before falling silent when Thomas cleared his throat. And behind the house, Harmon noticed freshly turned earth. Thomas explained it was a garden plot. Harmon, no stranger to farming, thought it a strange season for planting and a strange shape, more like a trench than a bed. Still, without a body, there could be no crime. Harmon understood the limits of his badge in a county where law was thin, resources thinner, and where privacy was regarded as a man's sacred right. To push harder without proof would have invited resentment, perhaps even violence. So he rode away, leaving behind the uneasy silence of that timber house and its watchful patriarch. Catherine returned to Springfield defeated. In her journal she wrote, "I cannot believe Eliza would leave her children. Something is terribly wrong, but I cannot prove what my heart knows." She continued sending letters and gifts to her niece and nephew, only to receive curt acknowledgments penned by Thomas. When she tried to visit in person, Thomas turned her away at the door. The family's silence became a wall she could not breach. And so the official record shows nothing but absence. A woman left, a husband remained. Children grew quiet under his gaze. Behind the words, however, lay an unspoken truth that in rural Missouri, in 1912, the disappearance of a wife could be explained away with little more than a husband's word and a sheriff's weary shrug. The law had looked, and then it had looked away. After Sheriff Harmon's visit, the Whitlock homestead settled back into its strange rhythm. On the surface, life appeared orderly. The farm was tended, the children were clothed, and Thomas went into town for supplies. But beneath that appearance, something darker took root, and those who crossed the threshold noticed it. Martha Jenkins, a local woman who began helping at the Whitlock home during the summer of 1912, would later recall her unease. Thomas had strict rules. Certain areas of the property were forbidden, especially the root cellar he had built behind the house. Once, when little Mary wandered too close to it, Thomas grabbed her arm with such force that she cried out. He apologized afterward, claiming dangerous tools were stored there. But Jenkins said she never forgot the way he reacted, sudden, panicked, almost desperate. Thomas also changed in his habits. He became a restless figure, pacing the house through the night. When Jenkins arrived in the mornings, she often found him at the kitchen table, eyes red-rimmed, muttering about keeping watch and maintaining the barriers. He seemed to believe that threats pressed in from the outside, unseen by others. In truth, the threat had already taken hold within. For the children, the silence of the house was suffocating. In 1913, Edward and Mary began attending the one-room schoolhouse in Walnut Shade. Their teacher, Abigail Thornton, kept a diary that would later provide one of the few windows into the children's lives. She described them as unusually withdrawn. Edward in particular worried her, a boy prone to long silences, staring into nothing. Once, after lapsing into one of these spells, he whispered to no one in particular, "She's still digging." Thornton also noticed troubling signs in Mary's drawings. The little girl, barely 5 years old, filled pages with images of flowers blooming above figures lying underground. One drawing showed what looked like a small woman beneath the earth, her arms outstretched. Thornton noted the imagery as peculiar, but at the time, teachers had little recourse beyond quiet concern. Then came October of 1913, when a female visitor asked Mary about her mother. The child became so distressed that Thomas arrived the next day and removed both children from school for nearly 2 weeks. Thornton's diary records her fear that the children were being silenced at home. "Mr. Whitlock met my questions with cold anger," she wrote. "He said their education is his business alone." By 1914, Edward's episodes had worsened. He would become unresponsive, his eyes glazed, repeating phrases no child should know. Thornton recalled one chilling afternoon when he whispered over and over, "She's under the ground." She tried to raise her concerns with Thomas. His reply was blunt, keep such thoughts to herself, or he would remove the children permanently from school. In a time when fathers held near absolute authority over their households, there was little she could do. The years that followed were marked by deepening unease. Jenkins, still coming to the home for housework, said she grew accustomed to Thomas's sleepless nights and his insistence that Eliza's name never be spoken. The children were instructed to tell anyone who asked that their mother would return when she was better. The lie hung heavy in the house. Then, suddenly, in 1917, Thomas sold the property. He accepted far less than its assessed value, handing it over to cattle rancher James Harker. The sale was rushed, completed within weeks of a letter from the county superintendent requesting a meeting about the children's welfare. Thornton, it seemed, had finally reported her concerns. Thomas wasted no time. He packed up his children, abandoned the valley, and moved north to Kansas City. When Harker took possession, he began altering the property. He demolished the remnants of the root cellar. In its depths, he found peculiar traces, interior walls dividing the underground chamber, and buried among the rubble, a woman's hairbrush with strands of dark hair still knotted in its bristles. He thought little of it then, dismissing it as household debris. But decades later, when investigators came asking questions, that hairbrush would take on a far grimmer meaning. And so, by 1917, the Whitlocks had vanished from Taney County, leaving behind only a fortified house, a demolished cellar, and children who carried secrets in their silences. The valley returned to quiet, but the earth had already recorded its testimony. It would wait, patient as stone, until someone came to listen. When Thomas Whitlock left Taney County with his 2 children in 1917, it was not a gradual departure. It was abrupt, almost frantic, as if the valley itself threatened to expose him. Within weeks of receiving the superintendent's inquiry into the children's welfare, Thomas sold his farm for a fraction of its worth and boarded a wagon for Kansas City. The Ozark Hollows swallowed the silence he left behind, while the city's noise seemed to promise a kind of anonymity. Kansas City in the late 1910 seconds was a place in transformation. Streetcars rattled across bridges, jazz clubs pulsed through the night, and the city grew fat on wartime industry and the shadow economy of prohibition. For the Whitlocks, it was the opposite of Taney County's lonely hills. But anonymity has its own dangers. In the city, secrets could be buried beneath noise, not snow. Thomas found work as a night watchman at a warehouse, a job that suited his solitary disposition. Records show he kept that position for over a decade, until illness forced his retirement in 1928. To his neighbors, he was a strict, private father, unremarkable in the working-class districts of the city. He raised Edward and Mary in the same rigid silence that had defined the Ozark homestead. No one remembers him speaking of Eliza. Those who inquired were met with a flash of irritation, as though the name itself were forbidden. Edward grew into a tall, quiet young man who followed his father into the warehouse. His school records revealed a boy who struggled with absences of mind, teachers noting strange spells when he sat unresponsive at his desk. Later, co-workers at the warehouse would recall his tendency to drift into silences, staring at unseen corners. When the Second World War arrived, Edward enlisted. In 1944, he was killed in action. The death was reported without fanfare, a soldier lost among many. Mary's story unfolded differently. As a young woman, she married Richard Coleman, an insurance salesman, and moved to Omaha in 1929. Outwardly, her life looked conventional. Marriage, children, a household in the American Midwest. But shadows followed her. Richard would later describe her as loving but somehow absent, as if part of her mind remained locked in another place. She was plagued by phobias that seemed irrational to others, but made perfect sense against her hidden past: an aversion to basements, terror at the sound of digging or scraping, and a refusal to enter enclosed spaces. Her children grew up under rules they did not understand: never dig holes, never play in dark cellars. Only after her death would her son Robert piece together why. Thomas himself did not live to see these truths resurface. In 1931, he died in a Kansas City hospital of pneumonia complications. He left behind no confession, no explanation, only a trail of silence that stretched back to the Ozarks. For the community around him, he was just another aging laborer carried off by illness. For his children, he remained the figure who had raised them within walls of secrecy. Yet even in Kansas City, the past was not truly buried. Neighbors would later recall small details: how Thomas stiffened when asked about his wife, how Mary flinched when other children mentioned their mothers, how Edward often walked the streets at night as if driven by a restlessness he could not name. These fragments would seem meaningless until 1952, when the discovery of Eliza's diary cracked open the Whitlock story. For decades, though, it seemed as if Thomas had succeeded. He had buried his wife twice, once in the earth of Taney County and once in the story he told his children. In Kansas City, that story held, and no one thought to ask what might be buried deeper still. For nearly 40 years, the Whitlock name drifted into obscurity, remembered only by a few neighbors who spoke of the family that vanished from the hills. The house itself decayed, the roof sagging under storms, its timbers creaking in the wind. By 1950, local teenagers dared one another to spend nights there, whispering that the place was haunted by a woman's cry. Most laughed it off, but the land was holding something, waiting for someone to uncover it. That someone came in 1952. Walter and Ruth Simmons, a couple from St. Louis, purchased the abandoned property, hoping to turn it into a hunting lodge. Clearing brush behind the house, they stumbled upon a depression in the ground, a collapsed entrance to what looked like an old root cellar. The stones had caved in long ago, but wedged between them was a small leather-bound book, swollen from water damage and years of decay. Ruth picked it up, brushing away soil, and discovered it was a diary. The name on the inside cover was still legible: Eliza Whitlock. The diary was fragile, its pages clinging together, its ink blurred, but enough words remained to tell a chilling story. At first, Eliza's entries described ordinary rural life, children's lessons, the rhythms of the farm. Then, gradually, a different tone emerged. She wrote of her husband's growing paranoia, how he paced the house, spoke of unseen dangers, and nailed their bedroom window shut, though the first frost had not yet come. She wrote of her children no longer allowed to wander beyond the yard. She wrote of the root cellar Thomas called a sanctuary, but that she described as a tomb. One entry dated the 14th of August, 1911 read, "T watches constantly, says the house is not secure enough, speaks of dangers I cannot see. When I suggested visiting my sister, his face changed in a way I cannot describe." Another from October noted, "The midwife came today. I wanted to speak freely, but could not with him standing there. When she left, he said no one else would be permitted inside this house again. They bring contamination," he says. In January 1912, her writing grew frantic. She described a tonic Thomas pressed upon her each evening that left her groggy. She began pouring it into a potted plant when he wasn't looking. The plant died within days. By February, the words broke into fragments. "He has hidden my boots. He says to protect me from illness. But I know the truth. I must get the children away. The snow is too deep, miles from town." The final entry, dated the 17th of February 1912, was just 3 lines, jagged and desperate. "He found these pages tonight. His rage was terrible. The children are locked in their room. I hear him digging again." With this discovery, the whispers of old rumors hardened into evidence. Sheriff William Masterson, successor to Harmon, reopened the case. On the 18th of June 1952, investigators excavated the ground where the root cellar had once stood. What they unearthed ended all doubt. Beneath the limestone soil lay human remains, identified by dental records as Eliza Whitlock. She had been buried face down, her wrists bound with wire. The bones of her skull bore signs of blunt force trauma. Even after 40 years, fragments of tissue preserved in the dry soil revealed traces of a sedative corroborating her words about the poison tonic. The Ozark silence had finally broken. Eliza had been found. But discovery is not the same as closure. The man responsible was long dead, buried under his own false narrative. Edward, her son, had already perished in war. Only Mary remained alive, by then a wife and mother in Omaha. To her, the sheriff's news was not revelation, it was confirmation of a truth buried in her nightmares. The diary, warped and faded, became Eliza's voice from beyond the grave. A voice silenced in life, bound in wire, left in darkness, yet stubborn enough to press through stone and time to demand the world listen at last. The discovery of Eliza's remains in 1952 did not just reopen an old case, it ignited a flood of memories long buried in the minds of those who had lived in Taney County during the winter of 1912. Neighbors, now gray-haired, came forward with stories they had once dismissed, half-remembered details that now seemed heavy with meaning. One of the most chilling recollections came from Clara Jensen, who as a girl had overheard her father discuss Thomas Whitlock's purchase of a large quantity of quicklime from the Forsyth hardware store. At the time, Thomas explained it was for sealing the damp walls of his root cellar. But quicklime has other uses well known to anyone familiar with burial. Clara also recalled her parents whispering about strange sounds drifting across the hollows that winter, scraping, pounding, noises her father attributed to wild animals. In hindsight, she wondered if those sounds were not echoes of something darker. Her brother Harold remembered an encounter with Edward Whitlock, then only a boy of 6. Edward had asked him in a hushed voice if people could hear sounds through the ground. When Harold asked why, the boy replied, "Father says no one can hear anything once it's packed down tight, but I think I still can." Before Harold could ask more, Thomas appeared, his hand gripping Edward's shoulder, his voice cold as he led the boy away. At the time, Harold had told his parents, who brushed it off as childish imagination. But in 1952, that memory returned to him like a wound reopened. Investigators digging further into Thomas's past found shadows that stretched back a generation. Records from the state lunatic asylum in Nevada, Missouri revealed that Thomas's father, William Whitlock, had been committed in 1890 for violent paranoid delusions. William believed his wife was conspiring against him with neighbors. He tried to imprison her in their home, convinced unseen forces sought to poison him. He died in the asylum in 1902. Letters preserved in the file show Thomas's mother, Sarah, begging doctors to tell her whether her husband's condition could be inherited. The answer she received was vague but ominous. Not necessarily, but caution was advised. The Whitlock curse, it seemed, was not just isolation. It was a bloodline steeped in paranoia. What Eliza had endured was not merely a husband's cruelty, but the resurgence of a sickness passed from father to son. Even the geography of the valley seemed to play a role in the story. Professor Alan Matthews, a historian of Ozark folklore, visited the property in 1952. He studied the hollow and its limestone bluffs, noting how sound carried strangely in that terrain. He conducted simple tests, dropping stones and listening to echoes ricochet between slopes. If someone dug at night here, he wrote, the sound could travel unnaturally far. To a passerby, it might sound like ghostly tapping or weeping carried on the wind. For decades, locals had whispered that the Whitlock place was haunted by a crying woman. Matthews suggested those stories may have begun with the very real sound of Thomas's shovel cutting into frozen soil. Folklore, geology, and memory had merged into legend, but beneath it all lay something plain and terrible. A woman silenced, buried beneath the earth, while her husband told the world she had left. The echoes through that hollow were not just sounds, they were warnings, warnings ignored, warnings that had taken 40 years for the land itself to force back into the light. When the ground finally gave up Eliza's body in 1952, investigators also turned their eyes to the children who had lived above that grave. By then, Edward was long gone, killed in combat during the Second World War. Mary, however, was still alive. Mary Coleman now, married with children of her own in Omaha, Nebraska. What emerged about their lives revealed not just the crime itself, but the silent scars it had carved into the next generation. Edward's troubles had appeared early. Teachers in Walnut Shade remembered him as a boy prone to long silences, sometimes staring into nothing as if listening to a voice only he could hear. Later, school records in Kansas City showed the same pattern: declining grades, episodes where he became unresponsive, whispers about noises at night. Today we would call it trauma, perhaps post-traumatic stress, but in 1914 there was no language for such things. He drifted into adulthood carrying invisible burdens, and when war came, he left to fight abroad. Some suggested that perhaps he was seeking an escape, as if battlefields were less haunted than the memories of his childhood. His death in 1944 erased his chance to ever speak of what he had endured. Mary's response to the same childhood was more subtle but no less haunting. As a little girl, her drawings had already betrayed an obsession with burial. Small figures beneath the ground, flowers growing above, stickmen digging with spades. When her son Robert discovered those drawings decades later, hidden away in an attic trunk, he finally understood the rules that had governed his childhood. His mother's nightmares, the ones about muffled cries beneath the floorboards, about dirt falling in the dark, had been memories, not fancies. Richard Coleman, Mary's husband, gave investigators a glimpse into her adult life. He described her as loving yet distant, as if some part of her was locked in a room she could never open. She suffered from anxiety attacks triggered by the sound of scraping or digging. She refused to enter basements or any underground space. To her children, she imposed strange rules. Never play in the cellar, never dig deep in the yard, never wander out of her sight. At the time, those rules seemed overprotective, even irrational. Only after 1952 did Robert realize they were echoes of her own terror, an attempt to protect her children from shadows she could never banish. Psychologists later analyzed Mary's childhood artwork and concluded it bore the marks of trauma-heavy strokes where she drew the ground, repeated images of entombment, figures trapped below the surface. One psychologist noted, the child was attempting to express something she could not say, encoding memory into imagery. This was not fantasy, but memory's residue. Robert himself traveled to the Ozarks in 1968, visiting the land where his grandmother had died and his mother had lived as a child. Standing there, he wrote, he felt sorrow not just for Eliza but for Mary, who had carried the silence her entire life. Some secrets refused to stay buried, he wrote in a letter to the Historical Society. My mother lived in two worlds, the one she showed us and the one she never escaped. This is the cruelest legacy of hidden crimes. They do not end with the victim. They echo outward, shaping the children who survive, and sometimes even their children after them. Eliza was bound and silenced in 1912, but her voice still lived through Edward's whispers, through Mary's drawings, through the rules and fears passed down to her grandchildren. The Whitlock children were not only witnesses to a crime, they were its second victims, carrying trauma in silence, each in their own way. Their lives remind us that when horror takes root in a family, it grows long branches, reaching decades into the future. The Whitlock case was not only about a husband's violence or a wife's suffering, it was also about the world that allowed it to happen. In early 20th century rural Missouri, the stage was set for certain crimes to disappear almost as easily as the people who suffered them. Eliza's vanishing was not an isolated tragedy, but the product of a landscape, a culture, and a system of law that all conspired unintentionally but fatally to cloak her fate. In the Ozarks, distance was a way of life. Homesteads were tucked in valleys and hollows where the terrain itself discouraged intrusion. A woman could scream, and her voice would die against limestone walls before reaching another ear. Roads were little more than muddy tracks, often impassable in winter. Snow and ice could seal entire families into their cabins for weeks, sometimes months. Neighbors might not see each other until spring thaw, and by then, anything could have happened behind closed doors. That geographic isolation fed a cultural one. A man's home is his castle was more than a saying, it was an iron law of frontier living. Privacy was prized above all, and interference in family matters was considered a serious offense. Even when midwife Harriet Bowman left the Whitlock home unsettled by what she'd seen, she spoke cautiously, knowing suspicion was not enough to justify intervention. When schoolteacher Abigail Thornton worried about the Whitlock children's silence, she too hesitated, fearing reprisal from Thomas if she pushed further. In both cases, concern met the brick wall of custom. Family matters were family matters. The law itself was equally limited. Sheriff James Harmon rode out to the Whitlock property in 1912 and did what he could. He took statements, checked drawers, made notes, but without a body, without visible evidence of violence, there was no crime he could pursue. He might have suspected Thomas's cold demeanor, the trench of freshly turned earth, the children's frightened glances. But in the eyes of Missouri law at the time, suspicion was not proof. With scarce resources and public pressure to leave families alone, Harmon's hands were tied. He left with unease scratching at his conscience, and the case slipped into silence. Criminologists decades later would coin a term for such tragedies: invisible crimes. Acts of violence so effectively hidden by geography, culture, and circumstance that they left almost no trace until years, even decades later. In cities, disappearances drew attention quickly. Social networks, neighbors, employers, churches noticed when someone vanished. But in rural America, especially in the Ozarks, a person could simply be gone, and the story that they went away was enough to satisfy curiosity. Even the natural world seemed to conspire in keeping Eliza's fate hidden. The limestone soil of Taney County, dry and alkaline, preserved rather than destroyed. It kept fragments of tissue, traces of sedative, and her diary, which might have rotted to pulp in wetter earth. The very ground that entombed her also guarded the evidence that would one day speak for her. Professor Alan Matthews noted this irony. The soil that silenced her also kept her voice alive, waiting for a later generation to hear it. The combination of distance, silence, and soil created perfect conditions for Thomas's crime. The snow buried the sounds, the culture buried the questions, and the earth buried the body. Only the eventual crumbling of walls and the chance discovery of a diary decades later broke the spell. The horror of the Whitlock case, then, was not just what Thomas did, but how easily the world allowed him to do it. It was a crime that hid in plain sight, protected by isolation, excused by custom, and overlooked by law. A crime so ordinary in its concealment that it might have stayed hidden forever if not for the way the land itself refused to keep the secret. By December of 1952, the case was officially closed. Eliza's remains, at last, were given a grave in Springfield beside her parents and sister. The sheriff's report named Thomas Whitlock as the killer, though by then he had been dead for over 20 years. There would be no trial, no confession, no justice in the legal sense. Yet the silence that had smothered her story was finally broken. But closure is not the same as peace. For Mary, the little girl who had once drawn flowers above underground figures, the truth came too late. She had lived her life under the shadow of absence, married, raised children, and carried nightmares she could never explain. When investigators contacted her in 1952, she insisted she remembered nothing unusual about her mother's disappearance. Her husband later confided that she suffered from recurring dreams of a woman's muffled cries beneath floorboards, of scraping sounds in the dark. Trauma had been buried deep inside her, surfacing only in nightmares, phobias, and the strict rules she imposed on her own children. Her son Robert's discovery of her childhood drawings in 1968 became the final echo of Eliza's story. The drawings were crude, childlike, yet devastating. Stick figures stood above a small body beneath the ground. One was labeled in uneven letters, "Mama sleeping." Robert traveled to the Ozarks that summer and wrote in his letter to the Historical Society, "Standing on that ground, I felt the weight of two burials, my grandmother beneath the soil and my mother beneath her silence." Historians and criminologists later dissected the Whitlock case as an example of how isolation enables violence. Professor Matthews of the University of Missouri wrote that the Ozarks' rugged terrain and the culture of non-interference created a natural fortress for invisible crimes. Criminologist Elaine Foster argued that Eliza's disappearance was not simply a family tragedy, but a systemic failure, a society too willing to accept the narrative of abandonment because it was easier than facing the horror of domestic murder. And yet, Eliza's diary remains the most haunting document of all. Across pages stained by time, her handwriting shifts from steady lines to frantic scratches. Her last words, "I hear him digging again," collapse the distance of decades. They remind us that the true horror is not always sudden violence, but the slow erosion of safety within one's own home. What the Whitlock case leaves behind is not only a tale of a murder, but a meditation on silence. Silence of neighbors who did not ask questions, silence of officials constrained by law and culture, silence of children forced to swallow what they had seen and heard, and finally, silence of the victim herself, her voice muted by fear, her body bound in wire and hidden beneath the ground. But the land did not forget. The limestone soil preserved what Thomas tried to erase: a diary, fragments of tissue, a skeleton that still bore the marks of wire and violence. Decades later, those relics rose from the earth to testify against him. The ground itself became a witness, refusing to keep the secret any longer. Eliza's story is not just about what was buried, but about what endures. Trauma passed from mother to daughter, from daughter to grandchildren. Folklore of a crying woman drifting through the hollows. Scholars who continue to study her case as a lesson in the dangers of isolation, and the chilling reminder that the monsters we fear are not supernatural but human, ordinary men whose minds turn against those closest to them. In the end, what the ground remembers cannot be silenced forever. Beneath the snow, beneath the soil, beneath the silence, the truth waits. And when it finally emerges, it speaks with a voice more powerful than any living witness, the voice of the buried, demanding to be heard.